Hello, grade 12 scholars, it's Miss Novak, and we are back for week 6, lesson 25 of your ELA online learning. As always, you can expect variety in these lessons, something new each day. I'll make sure to provide a list of materials and resources that you'll need for the learning. We'll go through an overview of the different components of the lesson for that day. We'll make sure to go through a model, especially as it relates to the writing task, so that nothing takes us by surprise. And of course, we'll preview the learning target for tomorrow's lesson. This week, we will begin reading an excerpt from Buried Giants, a novel by Kishiro Ishiguro. We'll complete a first read today, and we'll complete an objective summary of the text. The link for today's video is titled ELA G12 W6 L25, and we'll need the text Buried Giant, which can be found in our packet. A weekly reminder, really a daily reminder, share your learning with someone at home, call a friend over the phone. This text is really interesting and there's a lot of things in there are debatable, so it's an interesting thing to talk about. Also complete your fluency practice. Now, if you ever have any doubt about starting or getting back into it, make sure you review the directions that can be found in the first few pages of your packet. And next, make sure you always carve out that 20 minutes of independent reading time. We love our daily pictogram puzzles, and this one on a Monday is, in my opinion, pretty difficult. But let's not hold back. Take a few minutes to look at the image and think about what types of words or phrases it brings to mind. Pause the video here if you need to. We'll reveal the answer in a moment. And the answer is once upon a time. Now get it? It's the word once upon a time, could be any time, really. Maybe that's what threw me off. I don't know. I didn't get this one, but I know that I'm now ready to delve into some thinking that I can handle about this text. So let's get started. Note that all of your materials, as usual, can be found in your grade 12 learning packet. We are on lesson 25, which is on page 83. The note catcher for this lesson is on page 84. The text is on pages 78 through 82. And of course, have a pencil handy or highlighter. As you can see, I'm already highlighting. So pretty happy about that, but I hope you are too. Let's get our materials together before we start our learning. So take a few minutes, make sure you have everything you need. As I mentioned, we'll be starting a new text this week. We're going to be reading an excerpt from the novel A Buried Giant by Kishiro Ishiguro, which features two elderly characters, Axel and Beatrice, who live in 6th century Britain. Until this point, we have read texts that have been informative in nature about Britain. So I'm excited to explore this fictional story with you that's narrative in nature. In this excerpt of Ishiguro's novel, we will see how the storyteller describes rural Britain during this early time period, and we'll think about how this differs from Bede's description of Britain in last week's text. As you read, continue to keep the essential question of the unit in mind. What does it mean to call a place home? And as always, let these questions guide your reading and analysis of the text. What makes a place important enough to write about? And in what ways is home both a place and a state of mind? Keep these in mind before we launch into our learning and during our reading journey. If you'd like to join in, feel free to read this learning target. It's a very simple learning target, but it's important. I can read and summarize a narrative text. As I mentioned, this week's text is going to feel and sound a bit different from the text that we've previously read, which is great because variety is a spice of life. Today we'll begin with a first read of the text. We are reading only an excerpt, which is a part of the whole, so keep this in mind as we're reading along. You'll keep the process of a first read front, line, and center, which is noticing, annotating, connecting, and responding in writing. Next, you'll be asked to think about the ending of the excerpt and to make a prediction of what you think might happen next. In your discussions, you'll be talking about the two characters that are presented in the story, Axel and Beatrice. We're also going to be completing an objective summary of the text as your writing component. Another part of this task is to lift up those unfamiliar vocabulary words and to use some context clues to help you first figure them out before turning to the dictionary. Before we begin reading the excerpt, let's learn a little bit more about the author. We're going to be completing a first read here, so it's important to follow along. Again, this section can be found right inside of your packets. The author's name is Kazuo Ishiguro. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly out of respect. He was born in 1954 and has been telling riveting stories since his early 20s. He was born in Nagasaki, Japan, though he knew nothing about the 1945 Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings until after he moved to England at the age of 5. Ishiguro's novels often touch on the theme of memory and the ways in which it fades and gets distorted, as well as on humans' inability often to fully face the past. He has won many awards for his writing, including the Man Booker Prize for his novel, The Remains of the Day. So a couple of things that I noticed while I was reading this is that he moved to England at the age of 5. I know that from earlier that this text is going to take place in 6th century Britain. I wonder how his experiences in Britain have influenced his writing, especially because he wasn't clearly alive at this time. I also note that many of his novels touch on the theme of memory, and especially how it fades or gets distorted. We all know that it's rare to remember something exactly as it happened. So I'll keep this in mind while I'm reading the text to see if I pick up on any details that reinforce these points. Now let's go ahead and read the background section together. Again, this is found in your book, so feel free to read along at the same time. This excerpt from the first chapter of The Buried Giant is set in Britain around 6th century CE. After several centuries as a province of the Roman Empire, Britain had returned to local rule, but it also descended into violence and ethnic tension as the Saxons, a Germanic tribe, began to invade. This period also gave rise to many well-known legends, including that of King Arthur, a mythical British king said to have battled the Saxons, as well as dragons and other fantastical creatures. Oh, a lot of information here. First, I just want to point out something quick that we might have questions about, that we might not bring up to the surface, but that term CE, 6th century CE, stands for Common Era, the current era that we're in now, whereas BCE, you might have seen this before, stands for Before Common Era. Just a little tidbit, an interesting fact. As I was first reading this part, I noticed that Britain had spent several centuries under the rule of the Roman Empire, and that they were newly liberated and independent. However, I also think that this might be short-lived because Saxons were starting to invade. And remember, they were a Germanic tribe. Next, I noted that many legends involving mythical creatures and creatures such as dragons started at this time. We all know that dragons aren't real, which is why they're referred to as mythical, and yet they are featured prominently in literature at this time. So just a couple of things to keep in mind before we launch into our reading. Let's move into our first read portion of this lesson. So we already dabbled in first reading of the About the Author section and the background section, but now it's time to look at the excerpt as a whole. So as you begin to read, make sure you are following along with this standard first read process. But first, I do want to plug, like I did last week, this Bounce Pages app by Pearson. If you have this app downloaded on your phone, you can simply scan the page and it will actually read the text out loud to you, which is quite handy, especially as you're trying to digest what is initially going on in the text for yourself. So again, making sure that you're underlining words or phrases that pop out at you as significant, you're circling or boxing in words or phrases that you might not know. I'll give you a hint, a lot of them have footnotes, but we'll get to that later. And write down any reactions that you have or questions. Keep in mind, again, this is an excerpt, so a lot of them might bubble up at the end, especially as it relates to what might happen next. Please pause the video now and complete your first read. Welcome back from your first read. I know that you underlined many interesting points and circled many things that might have been unfamiliar to you, but right now what I want us to be able to do is focus on the last couple of paragraphs of the excerpt, because it does leave us a little bit on a cliff right there, right? We don't know what happens next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read those couple of paragraphs out loud. I'm going to ask you to follow along. And then I'm going to discuss some insights that I generated during my first read. I'll read from my packet over here. This morning, Axel moved the barrier just enough to let himself in, taking care to make as little noise as possible. Here, the early dawn light was leaking into the room through the small chinks of their outer wall. He could see his hand dimly before him, and on the turf bed, Beatrice's form still sound asleep under the thick blankets. He was tempted to wake his wife. For a part of him, he felt sure that if at this moment she were awake and talking to him, whatever last barriers remained between him and his decision would finally crumble. But it was some time yet until the community roused itself and the day's work began. So he settled himself on the low stool in the corner of the chamber, his wife's cloak still tight around him. Couple of things that I noticed here from reading this. We know that it's very early in the morning, and since he's describing the scene after he's come back from outside, he must have gotten up really early, or maybe perhaps awoken in the middle of the night. You know when something kind of presses your brain and you can't seem to get to sleep, or you wake up really early and you can't stop thinking about it? Maybe it's this type of situation for him. We also know that these thoughts must have been that important to wake him up. You don't just wake up for something small and insignificant. We also noted here that he wants to tell his wife Beatrice something about an important decision that he's been trying to make, but he decides that it's too early to wake her. I wonder if he'll still feel the sense of urgency when they finally talk. Right? You can tell that he's sitting there and he wants to say something, but yet he's being nice and allowing her to sleep. Maybe he wants her to feel rested when he finally tells her this decision. We'll see. Your thinking component of today's lesson asks you to think about the ending of the story. With a family member or a friend or a classmate, discuss this question. What do you think will happen next in the story? See if you arrive at a similar thought. Take some time to do just that. Welcome back. Now let's tackle the other components of today's lesson. Next, I'd like you to go back to the text and review all of the words that you circled because they were unfamiliar. Spend some time reading the sentences and each word to see if you can determine the meaning from the context clues that you find. Write your best guess of the definitions in the margins. After that, find a friend or family member and describe Axel and Beatrice to them. Although this excerpt is told from Axel's point of view, think about what you have learned about him and about Beatrice and share your insights. Finally, you'll move on to your daily writing. First, you'll write a 5 to 7 sentence summary of the text in your note catcher. Remember that a summary is a clear and concise overview of the text. You'll end by writing the unfamiliar words from your reading, looking up the definitions on your device, and comparing them to the guesses that you made during the earlier part of the lesson. And then write those words and definitions in your note catcher. Again, it's really important that you try to figure out the meaning of the word ahead of time because this is a really marketable skill that you might need. I'll be honest, when I was completing my work in the note catcher, some of those words that I didn't know were actually found in the footnotes. So I didn't even have to go to a dictionary. I could just go to the footnotes to uncover the deeper meaning. Just something to think about moving forward. Take some time to complete these components of today's lesson. As always, if you have any questions about today's learning or today's lesson, feel free to reach out to your teacher via email. Their first name, their last name at DetroitK12.org is your best chance to get in touch with them. I'm sure they'd like to hear from you. Now that we've completed lesson 25 of this week, let's take a look at the learning target for lesson 26. It reads, I can visualize the setting of a story using key details from a text. There certainly were a lot of details present, so tomorrow we'll really delve into them and perhaps even draw an image or two that conveys our understanding. Stay tuned. Thank you for engaging in this learning today. Before we jump off, let's make sure that we go through a couple of quick reminders. Don't forget to talk about today's lesson with someone at home, a friend, or a classmate. Make sure to read for 20 minutes independently, a text of your selection. I'm reading this guy over here and I'm telling you I'm so into it. I hope that you have found something that you're just as interested in. And make sure to mark your reading progress in your reading log. Next, always follow up with your reading fluency. You'll be utilizing the text from this week to mark your progress in the days moving forward. If you need a little bit of a refresher, turn to the directions in your packet. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow in lesson 26 of online learning.